There are many questions people are asking in light of the recent outbreak of the deadly Ebola disease in West Africa. And as Ebola spreads to countries outside of West Africa, many people are beginning to wonder if this virus is one of the many plagues described in the book of Revelation and the end times as prophesied in the Bible. So is it? What does the Bible have to say about Ebola and the end times? Obviously, Ebola itself is not specifically named in the Bible. The virus got its name from a river in Zaire in 1976. But just because the name Ebola doesn't appear in the Bible, we shouldn't automatically conclude that there isn't some reference to it when we're talking about these end-time plagues and pestilence. When the apostles asked Jesus to reveal to them the signs of his coming, Jesus told them of many signs to look for, and among those signs, he mentioned pestilence in Luke 21. So what is pestilence and plague? Merriam-Webster defines pestilence as a contagious or infectious epidemic disease that is virulent and devastating. Well, given that information and that definition, do you think the Ebola virus qualifies? I do. Right now, it is spreading through West Africa like wildfire, and between, 50 and now they're saying really 70% of those who contract it in Africa die. But this is really nothing new, and pestilence has always tormented the human race. Read the history books. In the 14th century, the bubonic plague killed 1/3 of European population in just a few years. Think about that. The bubonic plague killed 1/3 of European population. From 1918 to 1920, the Spanish flu, also known as H1N1, that pandemic killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people worldwide. Other kinds of plagues and pestilence, smallpox, tuberculosis, HIV, and other diseases have run rampant. Now, in studio with me to join me in discussion is a co-host for this segment, and that's Jill Martin-Rishi. Thank you, Jill. My producer, Larry Kutzler, I think, wants to weigh in on this. But Jill, as we were kind of preparing for this segment, you came up with some comparisons between Ebola and the 1918 epidemic of flu. And we're going to play a soundbite just a little bit later. But talk to me a little bit about some comparisons.
Well, this was a very dark time for America. 1918, the Spanish flu, they called it. And that was largely because Spain had battled it in the fall of 1917. And so it was a very dark time, but circumstances are different today. And as dark as things look with Ebola, and it is not something that can be looked at lightly, God is in control, and I think we really need to remember that. Again, Isaiah 41:10 says, do not fear, right? And we hear that all the time throughout the Bible, do not fear. Well, I thought it would be interesting to go back and take a look at the 1918 pandemic and see, compare circumstances, because we're not there yet. And it's important to remember that. We don't want to lose hope or become discouraged. So the Spanish flu began in Europe in late 1917, and the soldiers brought it back to the United States.
That's right, they did.
Yeah, and not only did they bring it here, but the soldiers going back at the end of World War I brought it all over the world. That was unprecedented, to have all of these soldiers grouped in one spot in Europe and then go out all over the whole world carrying this terrible virus. So that is one thing that's different than today. Another thing that's different is that particular virus, which they've now discovered is related to the H1N1 virus. That virus was airborne. And by airborne, I think we have to be very specific. Think aerosol, like a hairspray. If you stand in the sunlight and you spray hairspray, you can see all the tiny little liquid particles hanging in the air. That's truly airborne. And that's what this particular virus did in 1918. Now, today, we do not have an airborne Ebola. We have particles of fluid flying through the air, but they are generally considered to drop down out of the air onto furniture or onto the floor or onto people's clothing. So it's not the exact same thing as being airborne, but you still can't dismiss it. When we talk about Ebola, Jan, and this is part of the reason that the panic is out there, is that the lethality rate for Ebola is 70%. 70% lethal compared to the Spanish flu of 1918, which was 2.5%. People are very intelligent and they know these kinds of things. They know that there's something a lot more dangerous about Ebola. And so, yes, I do believe we need to be aware. We do need to watch out for our families and friends, but we cannot let the fear of it overtake us and stop us from the job we were called to do.
Also, back then, I mean, no respirators, no antibiotics, nothing, no dialysis, no electron microscopes, or specific knowledge of how to even identify a virus. I'm going to play a real short clip here. It's about this dreadful occurrence that took place back in 1918. And here again, we were a vigorous nation, and then this flu completely devastated the country.
In 1918, the United States was a vigorous young nation, leading the world into the modern age. All our fears and anxieties were directed toward Europe, where the war raged. At home, we were safe.
People didn't want to believe that they could be healthy in the morning and dead by nightfall. They didn't want to believe that.
It was the worst epidemic this country has ever known. It killed more Americans than all the wars this century combined.
It was a phantom, and we didn't know where it was.
In a gradual, remorseless way, it kept moving closer and closer.
You never knew from day to day who was going to be next on the death list.
There were so many people dying that you ran out of things that you'd never considered running out of before, caskets.
Before it was over, it almost broke America apart.
I remember my mother putting a white sheet, a white piece of cloth over his face, and they closed the casket.
You say, Jill, that the government was disorganized and slow to sound the alarm, a lot like today, only then they suffered more from ignorance, and today America suffers more from arrogance. That's very profound. I like that.
Well, it's really, when you look back at history, there's really a lesson to be learned. When I saw the way the United States government was reacting now, I thought, this is nothing new. I went back and I looked at what they were telling people back then. They were saying things to people like, don't sneeze on anyone else and keep your feet dry. These are the kinds of things that was being handed out in a list. You can find it in the archives, the government archives. And they did not understand what a virus actually did. They didn't know how it worked, and they didn't even know that it was a virus. They thought it might be bacteria more than a virus. So it was a completely different era. There were no planes, Dan. So we didn't have the same kind of travel issues that we have now. So in the light of everything that's going on with Ebola, yes, we need to be cautious. But I think we also need to remember that we're not where we were back in 1918. We should not have that kind of fear, that kind of panic. We should be relying on the power of the Holy Spirit, asking Him for peace, asking Him for joy. Be aware of your surroundings. Be informed, but do not allow fear to come in. Do not allow the spiritual warfare, the fiery arrows of the wicked one to harm you or the ones you love.